Welcome everybody, my name is 𝐏𝐸𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐿, and this is the Market Meditations podcast. We chat with fascinating people from around the world to extract mindsets, routines, stories, and habits to help you build richer lives. Meditators, today we have a treat for you. Nathaniel Whittemore, host of The Breakdown podcast, one of the best podcasts in the crypto space, one of my motivations for starting. He goes beyond just trading and investing and focuses a lot on big global macroeconomic shifts. You're going to really enjoy this conversation. We touch on a lot of interesting topics. Before we jump into this episode, don't forget that I send hand-picked market news, insights, and education to over 6,000 traders and investors 3 times a week. To get access to this, all you have to do is sign up to 𝐉𝐸𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐿.substack.com. Meditators, welcome to another episode of the Market Meditations podcast. Today we have one of my inspirations for starting this podcast in the first place. Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining us. He is the host of the Breakdown podcast, and he's got a whole bunch of other services as well. He's an entrepreneur in his own right. And I'm going to lead into this with the first question. How would you describe yourself, even though I've given a little bit of an intro to start the audience off?
Yeah, it's funny. This is like the one question in your list that I was like, I don't have a good answer to the describe myself in one sentence. I was like, well, like podcaster is obvious if we're being descriptive. I think in terms of like priorities, it's like family and learning and seeking things. I think in terms of if I was like trying to be cool and have it be like t-shirt worthy, it'd be like uninterested in conventional wisdom. Like, I don't know, but I spend my time podcasting, thinking about economics, geopolitics. I'm really interested in the way the world is changing. I think that's the common thread through everything I've always done is the world is always moving, changing, shifting. And I think that I've always wanted to be a part of the people who are a part of those changes rather than having those changes just kind of enacted upon them. And that manifests itself in a ton of different ways. But if I had to like kind of drill down to a common thread between everything that I've done, everything that I've been interested in, everything I am interested in, it's really about change and trying to wrench the world in the direction that you want to see it change in, I guess, for me.
I noticed you use the word people, not ideas. So, and the podcast gives you access to all of these people. Do you think it's the people making the changes or the big ideas which are then pushed forward by the people? I know it's a difficult question to differentiate between the two, but there is a distinction where Bitcoin is the idea, but then the people are the ones who are building and driving it forward, and the podcast is what gives you access to these people.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think it's a good question, although there's no good answer, right? In the sense that these things are obviously kind of inextricably linked. I do believe that if you look, let's actually, instead of talking about just Bitcoin or anything right now, let's go back historically. So there was a moment in my life where I was either going to San Francisco to do the entrepreneur thing and be in tech, or I was going to Oxford to study the history of British abolitionism. And British abolitionism, the movement to end slavery, was the first time in human history that a group of people had advocated en masse for a group that they weren't a part of. That had never happened before. It was a totally new phenomenon. And if you drill down into that movement, on the one hand, it was about the idea. There was a fundamental idea, like slavery cannot exist in a world where you assume that all people are made equal, have some, rights, like it is a fundamental contradiction. So there is an idea inherent in abolitionism at the end of slavery that without it can't be animated. However, when it comes to the movement to actually make the political change that took hold, and Britain ultimately was the first of kind of the major nations. It didn't necessarily get everything right for quite some time, but it was the first nation to ban the slave trade and then became the biggest policeman on the seas against the slave trade much earlier than the US, for example. And it was, you can track the history of the people that made it happen. First, it was groups of Quakers for whom it was antithetical to their beliefs, but they were kind of seen as like crazy out there hippies, and so they didn't really get it. And then it took a nobleman, Thomas Clarkson, being the advocate, and he spent 10, 15 years riding all around Britain, doing presentations, showing images of the way that people were transported like chattel from Africa to all these parts of the different world to build support. And then it took another person, William Wadsworth, on top of that, who actually was a parliamentarian, to take up Clarkson's banner to push it into reality, right? So you have these layers, an idea that catches fire with different types of people who have different types of access, who have different types of power. And for me, part of why I was so interested in studying that was almost exactly the root of that question. Is it ideas? Is it people? And even within the context of is it people, what type of people does it take? So it's a really interesting moment, I think, and very reflective of maybe what we're seeing now in terms of how change happens, and why when it comes to something like a new system, one of the things that has always interested me the most in Bitcoin was I still don't think, even how much we appreciate just how wildly unique in the entire span of human history it is for a founder of something with this much impact, value, wealth to remove themselves from the equation. It's just totally unbelievably phenomenal. And so I think it's there are these questions of kind of who picks up the mantle, how it kind of moves into the mainstream, are really interesting. And it's all about people taking a core idea or a core set of ideas and using the leverage that they have, the networks that they have, to expand it, kind of piece by piece and bit by bit.
Well, that was an incredible example to back up your answer. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure the listeners will love that. What means then is, where does your podcast, come into this carrying of the mantle in your eyes? Because you sound very passionate about it. I've been listening to you for so long. No one puts out these episodes 5 days a week if they aren't passionate and believe in the space. What role do you see the conversations you have on your podcast playing? And do you put any deliberate effort into putting the conversation in a certain direction or exploring certain specific conversations on your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so part of it for me just starts with, I like the way that I like to describe the podcast is that it is about these kind of big picture power shifts. And if you're going to deal with that, obviously economics is at the center of that. That's the particular angle that I focus most on. And in the context of economics, I don't think you can talk about big picture power shifts without talking about Bitcoin. So it's super Bitcoin centric, obviously, but not because it's by kind of definition just a Bitcoin podcast. It's about trying to understand the world. And I think that kind of what I've tried to do, and it's been a bit of a learning process, is like, you have to, on the one hand, I'm sure you know this because you have audiences in lots of different places that have lots of different interests. You have to find the right balance of giving them the types of content that they came for and that they were interested in, and the types of discussions that are most kind of comfortable, interesting, while also trying to find the right things that are maybe like 1 degree outside their comfort circle, interest circle, knowledge circle to explore, And so I like doing episodes where I can pull in, like China is a topic that it deserves and has entire podcasts just dedicated to the relationship between the US and China. It is a singularly defining and important relationship geopolitically for the world. And I want to, the guests that I've had to talk about that are not just talking about Bitcoin, right? It's not just the context of mining or blockchain initiatives or anything like that. It's the larger context, because I feel like we have to have that larger context. So I think, if I had an ambition for the podcast, I found that the audience that seems to really respond to it are really interested in learning, right? For them, Bitcoin, crypto, et cetera, they're almost like gateway drugs to exploring the rest of the world. And kind of, the sort of quintessential red pill for looking at the world differently. And in that context, I want to be able to help them get in touch with the topics, issues, and people that can help them expand their understanding, form new opinions, form different opinions, or just challenge, them to kind of learn more. I think that if Bitcoiners and kind of crypto people in general are more informed about the world than anyone else, it's a huge boon to the whole industry. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Oh, well, that is a fantastic way to look at it. And I love the deliberate effort put into, you understand your audience's base desires, which is probably why you're podcasts are so popular, but then you expand upon that and push them into useful and helpful different directions. But often those aren't the ones that they want to watch, and it can be quite difficult to get people to want to watch that. For example, the other day we had on Jameson Lopp, who's the CTO, co-founder of 𝐏𝐸𝐻, very focused on cryptocurrency security. And we spent a whole episode talking about the physical dangers which come with owning cryptocurrencies that often gets overlooked. Like no matter how safe you are online, you still need to take into account your physical security, but that's not going to get as many clicks or people watching it as my 450K Bitcoin price prediction. How do you find that? How do you actually push people to the direction of the topics that they want to learn, but they're not as enticed and excited about?
I think, in some ways it's a little easier for me because I do a daily show where I think that the relationship with the audience is such that, I've had a lot of times people on Twitter, on YouTube are like, not really interested in this. Or one of the things that I do a lot is I'll ask people which show they want to hear, right? If I'm kind of like in the morning deliberating between two different topics, and I'll occasionally get a comment that's like, to be honest, neither of these. And it's like, cool, man, like you can opt out for the day, like that's totally no problem. So I think that is a big piece of it. And over time, you kind of just like build trust too with the audience. I think one thing that's hard for content creators, I'm sure you experience this too, is fighting. Like there is a difference between producing the best show and producing the show that's always in the short term going to get the best clicks or the most clicks. And I'll give you for example. Yesterday I was debating between the implications of the Georgia runoff elections for Bitcoin and markets versus JPM's $146,000 price prediction. And I wasn't going to just do like, oh, cool, JPM thinks 146,000. I was going to do the whole history of like how their kind of relationship with Bitcoin and crypto has changed. So it had a cool angle. But I was sitting there and I was thinking about it, and I actually did this as a vote, and I got like, I don't know, 600, 700 people voted on it, and the JPM one won. But I was like, no, you know what? It's got to be the Georgia thing. It's more important, it's more contextual, and it's okay if, comparatively speaking, less people listen to that, because I feel pretty confident that the people who do listen are going to get more out of it and be more invested in the show, and again have higher trust with the show because of that, even if they don't think they like politics, because there's obviously a lot of Bitcoiners and crypto people are in it to opt out of politics, and it's very easy to be like, who cares? The honey badger doesn't care, right? Which is fine. That's a totally reasonable, like you're allowed to opt out of thinking about that. But I think the implications were big. So that was kind of an example of trying to make a decision that was best for the audience based on what I believe and what I'm trying to give than just what was going to get the most clicks. I will tell you for sure, and I'm not sure how, I know that you have kind of the distribution through both the podcast and the YouTube channel. YouTube makes it harder. It's unbelievably clear and easy for me to see how YouTube radicalizes content creators. Like it's just, I look at some of the other macro podcasts that have, their thumbnails are, is the Fed gonna come to your house and kill your babies? And these are guys who are like smart and thoughtful, but like, it's just so ridiculous. And I understand why, because I can watch the algos push the things that are more radical, more price predictor, whatever. It's not just like politically radical or anything like that. It's just extreme opinions, big flashy things. And on the one hand, YouTube has been a really interesting channel for me to start exploring. I've only been pushing everything to YouTube for a couple months. Unlike podcasts, there is a chance that any YouTube video you do, any interview you do, is going to just churn into the mill and get 100,000 views or 50,000 views, like even if you have no audience, right? I had my first video that had 50,000 views was when I had like 2,000 followers or something. Mm-hmm. That doesn't exist in the podcast world. So it's incredibly valuable. At the same time, I worry when it comes to these really important substantive topics that it's just such a grist mill for driving people to extremes. It's very hard to fight the temptation to put out something that I know that is just going to get slaughtered by the YouTube algorithms, as that becomes a bigger bigger channel. So again, I think I feel lucky in some ways. One of the upsides of doing the daily is that the net consequence is a little bit lower, right? If I was only doing a show or two a week, it would feel a lot harder for me to be like, do one that I for sure knew was going to be a little bit less kind of popular or indexed.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's a tricky question.
It is, and it's something I think all content creators do grapple with. The clear reward, at least from a click perspective, not a value add perspective, from using more sensational titles, things which entice emotions, curiosity, greed, fear, clearly outperforms, especially on certain platforms. It's not even close. So if the competition does that and even gives less value, they move at such a pace where it becomes almost impossible to compete, though we have lots of examples of exceptions, like your podcast, for example, which I'd say is very, very far from sensational and focuses very much like on value add. Even when your audience tells you, I want the sensational topic, you go for what you think will deliver the most value, which I absolutely loved. Now, to transition a little more into the more macro picture, which is where you specialize, I'd like to start with something you've said, which I absolutely loved and resonated with the instant I read it. You've described crypto as a lens through which you can view the world, or Bitcoin specifically. Could you elaborate on this? What is this lens, and specifically, how does it change your worldview?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of pieces of it. I think, to some extent, it gets back to this idea of the audience that I'm interested in are the seekers, right? The people who are trying to learn more, the people who kind of like don't want to just accept the conventional wisdom. And again, I don't mean that in like a cheesy, like, I don't know, don't tread on me flag kind of way. I mean that in the sense of like, there are tons of people out there who feel like something is off, or just that the things are changing so quickly, and they want to be able to put together the pieces to understand that. And I think what's so powerful, and why Bitcoin and the crypto industry as a whole are they have such they're like a black hole for people's minds and interest, is because there's so much dimensionality to them, right? Like you start getting excited about the price, as we all do, and I think it's completely reasonable to accept that. That's why I have no problem doing big price shows too, because like we all start like there's a Mr. Hodl on Twitter. He wrote he had a tweet that is famous to me. I don't know if it's famous to anyone else, but he said, "None of you fuckers would be here if number didn't go up." And the point he was making, someone was having a kind of a pearl clutching conversation about whether we should care about price or not. And I do think it's totally reasonable. Like we all walk in that door, at least to some extent. But once you get in, then you're having this whole conversation about the nature of money itself. And you can't really have a conversation about the nature of money itself without talking about societies and how they're structured and looking historically. And so all of a sudden, you've got like the set of books on your desk that are not about Bitcoin or about crypto, but are about the history of central banks and monetary policy and all this sort of thing. And I think, again, my prerequisite for someone participating in this industry isn't that they read all those things, isn't that they like go all the way down that rabbit hole. It's just what I found is that it is it's a context and a lens through which to explore all these bigger sets of issues. And I think that that's really powerful. We don't have that many things out there that encourage us to expand the way that we look about and learn and suck in information. And I think that that's a really good thing. It's why, to some extent, if there's one thing that I get nervous about, there's an interesting tension in all kind of crypto tribes between the the kind of social immune system, the things that kind of protect the ecosystem from external forces that are really just interested in the number and will be forever, versus like groupthink, right? And those are kind of can be thin lines, and I think that it's really important that these spaces, like, they're allowed to have their own kind of sets of rules and norms. I think I worry when everyone just starts thinking the same way, because that's kind of the antithesis of what this was about. We should have left and right Bitcoiners, just to as one, for example.
Yeah, I fully agree that there should be people looking at both sides of the argument, because while Bitcoin is the best solution I've seen to this problem, which is kind of what Bitcoin exposes, how fragile the system is, what COVID has exposed in a way, how fragile and easily everything crumbles, which kind of opens the doors to, hey, wait a second, Bitcoin could really change the world and change things. And not just Bitcoin, any idea or new revolutionary concept can do so. And with Bitcoin, we do have two very religious camps, it seems. It's either a scam and a Ponzi, or people who've gone a little further down the rabbit hole and actually see, this is a solution to this broken financial system. But it takes a while to see that. The price, the number go up, is the sensationalism, much like with the content that drives you in and gets you in there. It's what got me here in the first place. I was just a trader. It's only been this year, as I've explored the macro side more, that I've seen all these different arguments. And now, if the number goes down, I don't even care anymore, because I understand what it's trying to do. And I've not seen a better solution that can, at least I haven't seen a better solution for what Bitcoin offers. Is there anything you've seen that does the same thing and can offer this same world-opening lens that isn't Bitcoin?
Well, there are certainly lots of topics that one could explore out there that would allow them to see lots of different dimensions of the world. I think Bitcoin is more effective at getting people to think about the world than anything I've ever seen, right? So if the metric is what is going to take you down a journey of really exploring how economics works, how societies work, I think it's hugely powerful. I think for me, it's more, I don't want necessarily it to be a foregone conclusion for where that leads people. You know what I mean? And I think there are going to be a lot of really important political conversations that Bitcoiners would have a really interesting take on that. Some will opt out, and that's totally reasonable because for them, Bitcoin is a context to opt out. And I think that's what makes it powerful. I think Bitcoin as a way to opt out of a monetary system that you don't agree with, it's the thing that makes it such a unique innovation in the context of the history of the world. However, there are also we are going to have a massive national conversation in the US about things like UBI and direct stimulus. And the kind of layer zero conversation about that we'll have as Bitcoiners is like more money printer go burr. And again, totally reasonable. It's understandable because there are some very obvious second order effects that I think most Bitcoiners would agree with, especially given how likely to increase monetary velocity direct stimulus is. However, there's probably a layer one or maybe a layer two or a deeper conversation that one could have about, well, what are the priorities that society should have? Is there a world in which you could have much broader direct stimulus, but you didn't have corporations getting bailouts? You know what I mean? Would the world be a better place if the budget and monetary expansion was slashed by 90%, but the 10% that was left went entirely directly to people? Would that be a world that was flourishing, or would that exacerbate inequality? And if we only have the layer zero.
If I could interrupt right there.
Yes, sir.
There's so many variables to each of these problems which you've listed. How much do conversations with two people, much like we're having on a podcast, actually help move these forward, as opposed to a whole group of people taking into account every single variable and sitting down and discussing it in isolation, outside of just... Hopefully that's making sense, because there are too many variables at play to come to any statistically meaningful conclusion in, say, one conversation. So how do we push these problems forward? What is the solution there?
Listen, I believe very strongly that it is a messy, long process of talking, having your opinion challenged and changed, sitting with things quietly when you're alone and realizing that things are changing or that your perspective you have more conviction on, bringing that to a new set of people that are talking. Humans are social creatures, and ideas happen when they mate with one another. I think it was Matt Ridley who did a TED Talk in 2012 called "When Ideas Have Sex," and And it's basically about how all these big movements were ideas coming into contact with one another, right? I mean, fuck, Bitcoin is a huge example, excuse my language, but a technology tool, like a way to actually solve this problem of how two parties who didn't know each other could trust one another, plus the idea of a fixed supply or a digital scarcity, and making those things, those are two totally separate things that could exist entirely in isolation, theoretically, that when they come together form this very powerful cocktail. Add on top of that the creation mythology of a founder that vanished into the mist, and was, not just pseudonymous, but allowed the thing to become what it was going to become without them. Like, all of these ingredients, all of these different pieces, had they not been what they were, it could have been a totally different trajectory. And again, not to rely to everything, doesn't necessarily have to come back to Bitcoin, but I do think, again, it's a nice example of what we're talking about, of these conversations happen, they collide. Even the fact that there's, 15 years of experimentation with different types of digital money that happened before that. These things are slow and accumulative. And, I think that these types of conversations are really important because it's not necessarily that you and I or anyone who's in the conversation is going to then go have some revelation that changes things. It's much more, and I think this is why I like podcasting and I like the world of content that we're in. I think it's a golden age for ideas. It's the random person who listens and it triggers something in them, that is the context. Like, I'd had Michael Saylor on the show, and he has obviously become one of the most powerful and eloquent advocates for this asset and for what it means. And he charted his journey through content, and he can point to specific pieces of content. Vijay Boyapati's, argument for Bitcoin, specific Pomp podcasts, specific episodes of The Breakdown. He had these things in his file, basically, and so it's much more, I think that producing the content is much less about you or I in some ways, and much more about the sailors that it enables, if we do our jobs well.
That's a great, again, another great lens is to look at the world of podcasting through. And I guess it's a little bit different with market meditations, because our audience are primarily traders, investors, and entrepreneurs. We're looking at this all very much through the business lens, through the how can we create something in society in order to generate some sort of profit. Because, I mean, as traders and investors, what you're trying to do is increase profit. As an entrepreneur, it's a little bit more on the value add side, but the argument is a lot more focused. The ideas we discuss, the people we bring on are founders of the companies, traders and investors. Do you trade or invest yourself? And do you use the ideas you get from your podcast to take on trades or investments?
So I don't trade because I believe it's a discipline that requires actual dedication, meditation. Like, it requires, like, you can't just decide that you're going to trade kind of casually if you really want to do a thing. And so, even though I'll make investments, sure, like, but I don't consider myself a trader. I would say, and I think it's really fun to be on your show. The best traders that I know, it's not that they aren't interested in the macro or these bigger picture things. It's that they're able to separate themselves from ideology for the sake of what they're trying to accomplish in the short term too. But often I've found, like, they don't get wedded to their positions. There's kind of just a different mindset. But I also think that the folks who are, if you look at some of the absolute best traders in this space, they are also some of the most eloquent, thoughtful, and have long-term perspectives on this. I mean, just one example that's a really easy one is Sam over at FTX. I mean, this is a guy who is spent millions of dollars in political campaigns, and is the entire purpose of what he does or why he tries to make money is his philosophy around effective altruism, right? There is a big picture play for him and who he wants to be in the world and what he wants to do in the world. But he is absolutely, unbelievable when it comes to just execution in the short term. And that's part of why FTX has been such a successful project, right? So I think that there's, I just, like I said, I'm excited to be here because I think that it would be so easy for you, again, going back to like what content, to just be like, just the charts or whatever tips and tricks is going to be like useful for that day. And I think people are going to be better net if they have that plus kind of a larger picture. In terms of investing, I'm a very long-term person. I was in Silicon Valley for 10 years before this, and the things that I'm interested in tend to be, again, following this kind of like big world-changing things. Like I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at like companies in the emergent psychedelic space, because I am completely convinced that that will be a shift in pharmacology in the US. I think that the trend lines and trajectory are super clear in terms of just the way that regulation will happen or open up for those spaces. I think that the problems with existing pharmaceuticals are really, really clear. I think that we're at such a baby stage in our understanding of brains that it feels inevitable to change. So that's the type of, like, this is just a recent example of something that I'm interested in, not because I think that there's going to be some news this year that makes, it's like kind of like a lot of people got rich off weed stocks last year or the year before, right? And it's less that for me, and it's more the like, what is a big long-term shift that I think is interesting? Who are the players that are kind of enacting it?
The best traders, like you said, they stick within their circle of competence and focus on what they understand, detach themselves from the market. I love that you leverage Sam as an example. We've had him on the podcast. He is unbelievable to generate that level of wealth and value add in society solely driven by the motivation of altruism is incredible, like mind blowing. He's definitely a motivation for all traders out there, because as a trader, you're really not adding that much value to society. You're just arbitraging prices and taking advantage of emotional mistakes people make. Really, like, that is how a trader profits. So it's very important to do more to add value to society. And now, something I think the investors listening would love to hear more about is, could you expand upon the psychedelic industry you were talking about? What was that specifically?
Sure. So there are, yeah. So basically there are things like using microdoses of ketamine in PTSD, right? There are tons and tons of experiments. There have been, for the last decade, there's been a flourishing of science experimenting with very small doses, of different, either psilocybin, like mushrooms, right, or ketamine, or MDMA, or LSD, for treatments for PTSD in soldiers, for depression, for all these things. And again, we're still at a very early stage, but like the results have been hugely interesting. And I think that pharmaceuticals in general have been one of the more amazing innovations of humans over the last couple hundred years, but our relationship with them is totally screwed up, right? Like the fact that it's so easy to see how much we overprescribe things, how powerful some of these things are, and the idea that there's a whole different set of uses of substances that have historically been, people haven't continued their experiment. Like LSD started with huge experimentation, from governments and things like that. But then it became a drug, and then it became outlawed. And so those experiments stopped. I think that there's lots and lots of potentially really valuable uses of that set of things. And again, what makes it interesting to me is, like, imagine that we, like, treating PTSD in soldiers, for example, it's a hugely important issue. I think one of the things that I feel very, very strongly about is, it's like, you break it, you bought it when it comes to human lives. And if we ask people to serve whatever country we're talking about, you can't kind of leave them to rot when they come back as civilians. It's not an acceptable arrangement to me. And historically, just the kind of set of antidepressants and things we haven't necessarily always worked for everyone. And that's not a knock on antidepressants. Antidepressants, for the right people, for the right kind of brain chemistry, can be unbelievably powerful and unbelievably good. But more options, more tools, more things that aren't mediated by some kind of previous puritanical look at this substance good, this substance bad is really powerful. And I think that in general, if you're looking for bipartisan space in the US political dialogue, the kind of a libertarian-ish view of the substances that we put in our body is one space where you can get a lot of people from both sides of the aisle, if for no other reason, even if crassly, like look at marijuana, just because people from both sides of the aisle do it and enjoy it, so it's like some common cause. So to me, it feels like there's a clear public good in this. There's really interesting science around it that could solve really important issues. There's clear economic value if it goes through, and the big barrier in many ways is regulatory. And I think that we're likely headed for, regardless of administration, kind of more openness around this set of issues than less. So that's just one. Again, it's not the only thing I'm interested in, but it's one area that I've been kind of looking at and reading up on more recently.
It sounds, to circle back to exactly what we said before, very much in your circle of competence, something which is in line with all of your values as well. And if you're thinking very long term, one of the most difficult things is actually putting your belief into your investment. So with it being so aligned in your values, it makes a lot of sense that you would want to be somewhat exposed to that, invested to it, because you're going to be able to hold it through the ups and downs, as long as fundamentally any of your initial assumptions don't change. So great advice for anyone listening when they're looking to gain exposure to extremely long-term investments and assets. Looking more short-term at 2021 and not talking about your specific investments, what are the key themes you're most interested in on a macro level in 2021?
There's a lot. I think anyone who's interested in macro themes in 2021 has to be trying to figure out what changes a Democrat administration and a democratically controlled Senate could lead to in the US. I don't think it's possible to say that Biden has a mandate, after this. In many ways, it feels like the vote in America was just for something slightly more calm. The Senate being exactly 50-50, I think, is a good reflection in many ways of where the country is. It wants things to basically be like kind of debated, but not crazy, And so I think figuring out what are the likely implications? What are the likely implications in terms of monetary and fiscal policy? Does this mean that UBI is going to go through, and what were the implications of that be? Does it mean changes in terms of how, which types of business are going to be kind of supported or not? So it was interesting if you look at what was rallying yesterday before the insane scenes at the Capitol, right? But in the beginning of the day, when the Georgia runoffs looked like they were going to be pretty clearly both Democrats, so it was going to be 50-50 with Kamala Harris being the VP being the swing vote. The things that were rallying were oil, like gas, basically big industry type stocks, not classically democratic. And one of the explanations that I saw some people discussing was, in a world where there's low growth, right? Low growth world, you're kind of pushed farther out onto the risk curve, to things that are a little bit crazier. This is possibly part of the explanation for why technology stocks did so well last year. Now, of course, the other part of the explanation is that we had this world-changing event that reinforced all of the things, the new behavior patterns that were going to be 10-year shifts compressed into a year. And that's why technology stocks rallied. But I don't think that the idea that, obviously oil and gas and all these things is going to be trash, in a world where everyone's sitting around their houses. The idea that people had to go looking for yield and being further out on the risk curve, I think it's an important part of this. I think it's the same with when we look at interest rates, right? The lower the interest rates are, there's a reason that Silicon Valley valuations have been going up for 10 years. And it's not that the projects have been getting better necessarily, or that the markets have been getting bigger, although that's part of it. It's also that pensions can't guarantee the returns that they used to get from normal stuff. They can't park a bunch of their money in bonds and hope to make their commitments. So they have to move farther out onto the risk curve, right? So I think that one macro theme for sure that's relevant for traders, especially if you're in the traditional financial space, is what the likely implications are. And I think it's going to be a good time for people to potentially have their own alpha, because I don't think you can make, especially it's so split 50-50, right, in the Senate. I don't think that everyone has like a clear agreement about what's going to happen and what's going to be able to be pushed through. So that's really interesting to me. I think from a more intersection with the crypto space, I think that central bank digital currencies are going to be, they have been picking up as a part of the conversation, and an important part of the conversation since Facebook announced Libra. That was a starting gun for the nations of the world, for sure. And more than Libra itself, the way that China responded to the announcement of Libra, supercharging their project, coming out, moving it much faster, really kind of had the world get up and go. And if you look at kind of how that started to play out over the course of last year added a new raison d'etre for digital currencies, which was the distribution of stimulus and relief. If you look at the first Democratic proposal for relief last March or April around COVID-19, it included the creation of a digital dollar as the mechanism to get aid and stimulus out to people quickly. And that fell off because they kind of just, it was, this was in the course of a couple of days when they were planning this. They basically grabbed a proposal that had been sitting there from a couple of academics and kind of put it in there, that had some pretty serious structural issues. There are also really big issues with digital currencies in terms of the relationship between commercial banks and individuals and the central bank, and whether people just stop opting into, like, why would you keep your money with a commercial bank for safety if you could just keep it with the theoretically safest place in the world, So there are tons and tons of issues. The US has been cagey on it, but I think that one of the really interesting things that happened, so I'm sure your listeners, or most of them, are familiar with or saw that the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, came out with this guidance earlier this week that said basically that banks can view public blockchains as payment rails and settlement solutions the same way they view Swift, ACH, et cetera. This is one, it may not stand because Brian Brooks is, he's already created a ton of consternation. He's a Trump appointee. The Senate has not brought his renomination to be a full director. I could easily see the Biden administration kind of kicking him to the curb once they take power. But I think that I think part of the motivation for this is to open the floodgates. If banks are all of a sudden able to start interacting with stable coins and take advantage of the always-on nature of crypto, there's no going back. Banks are not going to surrender that capacity to transact on the weekends, off hours, very, very quickly, because there's so much money to be made. And I think that one of the really interesting things to explore is to what extent the integration of federally regulated banks in the US with USD denominated stablecoins creates a pathway to a digital dollar that is recognized by the Fed, but that is basically implemented by the private sector. Because if you just take the conversations about digital currency in terms of central banks creating digital currencies for themselves, China's way ahead of everyone in terms of major nations. Europe is talking about it much more. They had a comment period last year. Christine Lagarde from the ECB keeps talking about it, says it's likely, more likely than not, that it'll be a supplement to, not a replacement for cash. So all of those things, they feel much farther ahead than the US. If you listen to Jerome Powell talk, and we've seen some indications from Fed board people that there's research going on, feels like the US is way behind. That switches in a second if you just say, well, no, the US's digital dollar is just USDC. USDC dwarfs all of these other efforts already, to holding aside entirely Tether, right? But like when it comes to digital dollars, USD denominated stablecoins had an unbelievable year last year in terms of their growth, in terms of their use cases. It wasn't just crypto trading, although that continued to be a huge part of it and maybe the majority part of it. It was also when the crisis happened, you had businesses offshore who couldn't get access to dollars who were using USDC to settle accounts because it's a close enough approximation for the dollar. I mean, it's a new euro dollar. It's a new shadow banking system. It doesn't seem unrealistic to me that the US, with its history of a close relationship between government and private sector, says, screw it. The stable coins, USD stable coins are just by default a part of our infrastructure now. They're a part of the monetary system. And boom, the US has a digital dollar. It's a complete end run around China's digital yuan because, the whole effort, I think, of China's digital yuan is to get around the SWIFT system, basically, to get around the existing US denominated payment rails, the SWIFT system, which has been totally weaponized in terms of sanctions and everything else. And if all of a sudden there's this thing that's even easier, even faster to use, that still transacts in the thing that people are used to, that they have trust in, which is the USD, it potentially creates the opportunity for another generation of global dominance of the US dollar, just in another form. So I think, people who are in the crypto sector sometimes get, they're like, well, whatever. These things aren't, central bank digital currencies aren't really why I got into crypto. They're surveillance money. All of those things are important. But I think it's going to be undeniably huge as a theme for this year from a macro perspective. By the way, the thing did get rescheduled that I was mentioning. So I don't have any time pressure now.
Oh, fantastic. That is so good to hear. You literally answered 3 of my prepared questions in that one segment. It was fantastic. I was going to follow up with specifically why China was able to move so much faster than anyone else and why they were motivated to do so. But the SWIFT system seems to be the answer there. That was a threat to them, and this was an immediate solution. The US, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't have a similar threat, so there was no reason for them to rush into it like China did. Are there any other factors at play there that I'm missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that roughly speaking is right. The reason that the US is the huge portion of international trade already takes place in the dollar. China, for as big as its economy is, if you look at the world's reserve currencies, it's something like 70 to 80% USD, maybe it's a little lower now, another 25% euros, and then like 3% yen from Japan, right? China's nothing. And it's because people don't have trust in the Chinese government yet. I mean, it's, in this current form, it hasn't been around that long. There's a million reasons why. What China does have is a couple things. First, it's way more sophisticated in terms of its existing payment solutions and its interaction with mobile money, right? It's got a customer base that is completely comfortable with, paying with their phones and using their phones. So it's a much easier conceptual jump for them. Like all of us in the US are still literally pulling out wads of cash, or, like we think our credit cards are sophisticated, So there's that piece of it. There's also, to me, obviously I'm not in the CCP, and so I don't have insight into it, but it feels to me like part of the motivation was there's a lot to be said for, like, if everything is about trust in an asset, the thing that could compete with that is convenience. If you can't win on trust, why not win on convenience, ease of use, speed, finality, like all those things, right? You basically create, like, if you can't have the money with the best trust, have the money with the best features. And in some ways, I think that was the play that is the play for the DCEP, the Digital Currency Exchange Protocol, the digital yuan, is, let's get this thing out there as fast as we can. Let's leverage the Belt and Road program and our kind of network of economic partners, subservience, whatever, to, kind of enforce the use of this thing at the beginning. But then all of a sudden, like, I can see it being so much easier for businesses to transact in that they just go with it, if they're in China's sphere of influence. So I think that was part of their play. And the other thing in terms of why they're able to go faster, one, you have to acknowledge they have been researching this since 2014, right? So they were way ahead of the curve. They accelerated their efforts when Libra came out, but it wasn't the starting gun for them. It was an acceleration for them. For most of the rest of the world, it was a starting gun. So that's one piece. The second piece is they control all of the banks and financial infrastructure. So the implementation and rollout of this is way easier. They don't have to worry about, if the US announced tomorrow that it was going to have Fed accounts, this was the thing that was in that bill that I was mentioning. commercial banks would lose their absolute minds because, again, the exact same issue we talked about. It's like, how is this not just an end run on our reserves? Like, how is the relation? Why on earth, if every consumer could have a Fed account that was both convenient and safer, would they have commercial bank accounts? Now, there's plenty of ways to address that, but it would be a whole conversation, many committee meetings. You know what I mean? Like the nature of a decentralized system is that it moves slower politically, in the U.S. So there, I don't know. Again, like I said, some people aren't that interested in it. I clearly am. I think it's going to be a huge, not just economic issue, a huge geopolitical issue over the coming years, is this sort of remaking of money.
I mean, I'm likewise fascinated. The only argument I can see for why you'd opt for a central bank over the government is to sacrifice a bit of that trust for higher returns if they were able to offer it. But with how much interest banks offer right now, that doesn't seem like a viable solution unless they aggressively reshaped how they operate. Where does DeFi fall into the conversation here, especially with a push towards stablecoins and them becoming more used by the average person? Do you think decentralized finance is at a point right now where it can have a significant effect in 2021? Not just in terms of number go up, but in terms of, can it fundamentally change the structures we have in place?
So there's a couple things. I think that it's clearly having an impact just in this. The fact that stable coins are now allowed to be key infrastructure for federally regulated banks is a testament to the relevance of the innovations happening in this space. I think sometimes when we talk about the impact things can have, it's a little bit too we're kind of trapped in a mindset of, is it ready for the masses? And DeFi is enormously complex. And in fact, I think one of the reasons that DeFi has been able to survive this long is that the barriers to entry are so high that it's much harder. You have, like, when people lose money, they're pretty enfranchised money losers. And I think that's much healthier. You know what I mean? Like, when we had the 2017 run up, it was literally, you had projects out recruiting Korean pensioners in fucking nursing homes for their stupid token, and hold aside, like even without going as far as critiquing everything, like, that's abhorrent, like, it's just nuts. And you didn't see any of that as we had DeFi summer this year, right? Because it's like, what are you going to do? Have those same people like figure out how to use MetaMask? Like, no way. But that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. And I kept saying on Twitter and on the podcast, like, when people were like, yeah, DeFi is ready for mainstream, it's like, one, no, it's not. Like, and we clearly see that over and over and over again with hacks and exploits and stuff. Two, you shouldn't want it to be. This is the most interesting, like, for people who are in that space, it is the most pure play, crazy capitalist sandbox that's ever existed in some ways. I mean, these are markets unbound, but because there are those natural barriers to entry, they create guardrails, right? And allow this thing to grow and develop. And I think that for people who are kind of excited about that space, it's not going to be like all of a sudden DeFi replaces things. It's just going to happen very naturally and organically. Like you saw Shapeshift yesterday, maybe, or 2 days ago, announce that they were no longer going to be actively trading. So they're basically outsourcing all of their market making to decentralized exchanges. And their effort is they want to get out of the KYC business, right? They don't want to have people have to do that. Their answer is DeFi. Now, I think that DeFi is in for some serious legal battles because the KYC, Bank Secrecy Act regime is getting stronger and louder, not the other direction. And I always get a little when people say, well, they can't, like, it's impossible to regulate a protocol. It's like, don't underestimate the capacity of the US government to find ways to screw up the party. You know what I mean? And that's not FUD in the sense of we should all abandon it. Same thing with Bitcoin. Like these things, they don't exist in the same paradigm of previous types of companies where you could just shut it down or just stop it, right? But you can make it enormously more difficult to use, make the innovations that it creates much more limited. So I think there are going to be a lot of regulatory battles. But I do think, like, going back to the original question of how it's going to, I guess, how it becomes more influential. I don't think it's by having a billion users come in and interact with DeFi. I think it's a slow accession of different pieces of existing infrastructure to just use this. I think stable coins are the first piece of that, right? That they're just clearly offering something better. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see other pieces of this type of infrastructure start to find their way into traditional finance, you know?
Yeah, it'd be amazing to see. And what you mentioned about generally regulation is seen in a really negative light in the space. But if we want Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency to be a store of value and a means of transacting, we need stability in the price. And the more ingrained it becomes in the current infrastructures that are in place, the more mature it becomes as an asset, the less volatility we get, and therefore regulations are an essential part to that. Would you agree with that statement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, absolutely.
Oh, okay, then perfect. I was making sure nothing's missed there because someone I look up to generally on all these macro topics. So I like to almost confirm my opinions are in the right place. Definitely my specialties are more on the trading and investing side of things. So I'm going to switch gears again. And this time I'd love to dive into the insights you've garnered from running the Breakdown podcast. You've spoken to so many different types of highly successful people. What are the common themes you've noticed amongst them? What do they have in common? And what surprises you that they don't have in common, or what is variable among them?
I think one of the most interesting things, second part first, is you can take 50 of the smartest people that you've ever met and talk about the same issues and have wildly divergent opinions. And I think for me, the lesson from that is not to choose one or the other that's right. It's to be, I mean, completely comfortable with your conviction. It's that, like, there is so much to be learning, so many new kind of things to accumulate into your knowledge set. You know, like I've always I've had this, like, the way that my brain worked. I remember as a little kid, like, feeling like the world was like this big map and I only had these tiny little pieces filled out. And I was always very comfortable, like, having extremely strong opinions based on the pieces of the map that were filled out, you know? So it's like, based on what I know, I have 100% conviction in this thing that I think. However, as soon as there's a new piece of that map filled, a new piece of information, that might shift the way that I look at the world because it's new information. And then I'm going to be 100% confident about that, you know? And it's not even a strong opinions kind of weakly held thing. It's more like strong opinions based on what I know, but I always want to know more. And so I think that the one big takeaway is just doing the breakdown certainly confirms that there's just a huge variety of different perspectives on all of these issues that we've been talking about, and I think that that's illuminating in its way. In terms of things that are similar about all of these people, I mean, I think that you could probably chart on a map, or chart on kind of a list, all of the guests that I've ever had, and the ones who are the most interesting or the ones who are the least interesting are the ones who just parrot the same stuff over and over and over again, and kind of like, you know, they exist in a milieu of, this is my idea and I just stick with it, you know. And the ones who are much more interesting are people who are, again, sort of absorbing more knowledge, more information, having discussions live, you know, and like you can tell when someone is thinking through things actively as you're discussing it with them versus, this is a set of knowledge that I have and now I'm bestowing it upon you, you know.
Yeah, it's the bipolar mindset, being able to hold both your opinion and new opinions and constantly sway between one and another. And it's a very unique trait. I'm surprised that there wasn't a specific. I mean, normally the answer to that sort of question will be hard work, hustle, determination, more towards stuff which make people, by the traditional sense, successful. Would you have anything more on that side that you've noticed amongst highly successful people, or is it more just the open mind?
Sure. Well, so I mean, I guess maybe think about it from the reason that that's probably my answer is what I'm interested in the show in is people that I believe can help others understand the world better, and that's not necessarily the same as successful entrepreneurs. In fact, my absolute least popular shows are when I pull in someone from my old life in San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco for a decade, and it was in venture capital, it was in entrepreneurship, and I have tons of friends and kind of who are still in that traditional tech space. And people on my podcast simply do not care, which is really fascinating. But I certainly so I guess like I'm indexing for people who are like thoughtful, right? It's like the modern day academics in some ways. They're not academics. They're often traders. They're often investors, but their brains are thinking about these things. In terms of traits of successful people, it's so context dependent. So let's talk, I guess, about like in Silicon Valley, there are, because like I said, I spent 10 years there and, very close with a lot of very, wealthy, very successful people. There is hard work is a given. It's like a boring answer, like that. It's just a prerequisite for anything anyone wants to do ever. Um, uh, you know, eh, I guess what I'd say is maybe a little bit like different. It's not based on how smart people are necessarily. Like success as it relates, especially to technology startups and new tech, it is so much about whether your thesis around the world, well, one, either your thesis for the world is correct, or two, you're able to learn fast enough when you're able to build something that people interact with enough that you can listen to them rather than trying to project your thesis on the world. And I think it's very rare when the vast majority of startups learn from their users what the thing is supposed to be versus know it going in, and I think that the places where that like combines are pretty rare, and it's actually remarkable to me how often like let's put it this way. If I was to give someone advice about how to be successful in Silicon Valley, I would tell them to go, like, their first step should be to join the fastest growing Series A type company. Like, don't found your own thing. Like, if you just want to like bat with numbers, like most of the people who get rich in technology are rich because they like aligned their orbit around one of the very small handful of people who create, a huge amount of money for everyone else. So I don't know. It's an interesting question because I sometimes think that our conversations about hard work and success are like they're so overly simplistic, and they don't deny, like they we're not good at saying like people who are successful work unbelievably hard but also have an immense amount of luck like in it. Like, and again, I think Silicon Valley is a really good place to learn that. There is like you couldn't rank order everyone by smarts and have it be successful. So much of it is about timing, who they were connected to, so, and that's not to diminish anyone's success. It's more like there's a lot of people who you would think would have been or should have been successful who maybe just haven't been yet.
Absolutely. I'm not sure you noticed, Nathaniel, but your second answer actually mirrored your first answer a lot. The first one being people who can adapt their ideas, the second one being people who can adapt their businesses to new feedback and information that comes in, which I found very interesting and fully agree with. Well, partially agree with the luck point because there's a certain degree of luck, without a doubt, in anything you do: trading, investing, starting your business. Like you said, timing, knowing the right people, being dealt the right hand, being at the right place at the right time. But that can be engineered as long as there's consistency in place. Eventually, the luck will come, unless you are extremely unlucky or very much on the lower end of the bell curve, if you will.
Could agree more. Luck is we need a better word for luck. That's like it's something that combines like luck, proximity, timing, privilege, like all these things. They are really important concepts, but I agree that the term luck is super reductive because, to your point, like is someone who, like, two kids, one decides to go to Silicon Valley and be willing to like sleep on couches until they find that startup, versus someone who thinks that they can just do it from their house in Ohio or wherever, right? Like, is that person luckier because they met, even if both of them, like, let's say that we knew for a fact that the way that one of these two people was going to be rich was meeting Travis Kalanick, in the early days of Uber. That was how they were going to be rich. The person who goes and puts themselves in a position to do that, to network, is obviously, tremendously farther ahead. I will say for sure that, like, again, it's such a truism. I'm maybe trying to just add different things, but like, networks are the most important currency that anyone has when it comes to, the world and success, I think, in some ways, unless you're in an entirely individualistic pursuit. But it's hard for me to imagine that. I mean, I don't know, maybe, what do you think? Do networks matter to traders if you're just kind of like managing money? Like, where does that fit in? Because I've found across everything that networks are hugely, hugely important.
So if you'd spoken to me about a year and a half ago, I would have said, no, it's just noise. All you need is the numbers and the charts, and you make all your decisions based off of that. But I noticed throughout 2017, 2018, that I was seeing exceptional results from certain people who I personally, in my head, was like, oh, wait, they're not following the numbers. They're not following the statistical most optimal plays. There's a lot of discretion involved. Why are they doing better? And I spoke to a lot of these people to try and learn from them, try to keep my mind open. And most of them said two things. One, you need to focus on more than just the numbers. You need to pay attention to the market sentiment and what's going on a macro level, so you can incorporate to that and make your discretion more meaningful. And secondly, speak to other traders, because if you're going into the charts and just looking at the numbers, you're looking for alpha with no direction whatsoever. But if you're talking to this trader and that trader, and you're seeing what they're doing and you're learning from them, and they're giving you advice, and then you are sharing back with them, suddenly your compass gets pointed far more strongly in the right direction. So networking has been essential there, and networking is what led me to start this podcast as well. People told me, you have the audience, you have the influence, start the podcast. And I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but podcasts are a great way to network and meet incredible people, not just ideas, but get to know them and relate with them. I've done business with people who've come on the podcast, and we've just kicked it off. We really liked each other, and then we decided to start something together.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe the piece that you're adding, which is really important to this idea of networks, is that we sometimes think of networking as this like LinkedIn transactional thing, right? Where it's like, I have a network of people that I can ask for stuff and they can ask for me, stuff from me. But what you're talking about is like learning networks being the most valuable networks with trading, like things that help you contextualize what the charts are telling you, like that give you interpretations that help answer why. And I think that's really powerful. We don't think about learning networks as part of our networks because, again, it's like going back to the Silicon Valley example. You want a network of venture capitalists that you can go ask for money when you want to start. And that's definitely true. Like, there's a reason that it's so much easier for second-time founders who have been through it, who have those networks, to go raise money, because trust, experience, like it's just so much easier for an investor to get comfortable with that person. However, there's also this learning dimension where, what are you going to start? What's the right play? And people are, especially in Silicon Valley, as if you've seen from Twitter, like, investors will talk all the time about their ideas, but you get very different takes when you're talking closely, like one-on-one with people and just kind of having random conversations about what they're interested in, than you do just on what they decide to tweet about, right? And there is a lot of alpha in that kind of the network of learning that you can build. So I think that's really interesting. But
I think you might find this interesting as well. It's from Sam. When I asked him about his learning networks and whether or not he has them, his answer was, actually, no, I don't. I find I get too much different advice, and no one but me fully understands what's going on and what I'm trying to solve, which is something which happens when you get to those extreme levels of success where no one's really done what you've done before. So using that compass analogy, it's hard for him to get any better bearings on his compass, given no one's quite done what he's trying to do at his level, or not enough people for him to be able to learn from.
Yeah, I think I think so. My guess would be that if you asked a follow-up that was more like, how do you engage your team in ideas or something like that, the answer might be a little bit different. I think that like the like learning networks in terms of where you can pull from, it is different if no one's kind of like done the same things before. It gets a lot harder, and like the perspectives are, I don't know, the noise thing is real. I mean, like, yeah, it's when you're doing something new, it's going to be hard to have a set of people around. I find this, I guess, where one of the things that I think about a lot is one of the reasons that I wanted to leave Silicon Valley. So we moved a couple of years ago. We moved to upstate New York to be closer to family and things like that. And part of it was mostly just a family thing. We wanted to be closer to the East Coast where we were from. But part of it was that I was having a really tough time finding a lot of people whose like version of success was what I wanted. Like I couldn't point to just like one VC that I knew or one entrepreneur that I knew. And I was like, I want their life. Like there are parts that I wanted, like, you know, it's great to be rich and, you know, they do a lot of fun things, but like I was looking for someone whose like life I wanted to mirror. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And what I kept coming back to was people who had optimized for freedom, like the ability to decide what they're going to do, what they're going to spend their time on. And, you know, wealth is a part of that. Money is a part of that for sure. But I kept coming back to this guy that I had been a friend I was a undergrad at Northwestern and spent the first few years after school building a program that was sending students all over the world. And this guy I had met him actually just at a coffee shop randomly. And he was a private client lawyer. He did international tax law in Evanston, Illinois. And I spent a lot of time learning about him. He had like these 4 great daughters. He was in his 50s. And he was always like, at the same time I was like hustling my little face off at this coffee shop, he was having coffee with his friends and they did it every morning. And I learned about his life, and he was one of the youngest partners. He was made one of the youngest partners at 𝐉𝐨 Austin, which is a huge firm in Chicago, when he was in his late 20s. And he had his first kid, and he was like, if I keep this partner role, I'm never going to see her. I'm never going to be part of her life. I'm going to work 90-hour weeks. And so he left that, started this firm. He went out and recruited clients in the countries that he liked being in. So a huge part of his business was in Southeast Asia because he wanted to spend time there. And he designed a full life, and he did take a pay cut. You know, a partner at 𝐉𝐶 Austin can make millions easily per year, you know, whereas I don't know, he was probably making 600,000 or 700,000 on a good year. It's like, still, we're talking about numbers that are like, he made a very good life for himself, and he had this unbelievable freedom. He was engaged in his kid's life. And I kept coming back to that guy, like versus like these billionaires that I knew in San Francisco. And I was like, all right, I gotta think differently about it. And I guess the reason that it kind of resonated with me as you're talking about like Sam is I think we get into trouble perhaps when we think about these learning networks exclusively as like they're going to have the answer versus we're going to get lots and lots of little pieces of information that we can then assemble into our own personal programs about how we want to interpret it and then act upon it, you know?
That answer's given me such a better understanding of what drives and motivates you, which is extremely cool. Not chasing, but directing your life in the path of freedom rather than the path of just arbitrary wealth without an idea of what that wealth will then become is extremely interesting to me because it's something that's a bit of a struggle for a lot of traders in the crypto space because it's a 24/7 market. And especially this year with the bull run going crazy, so many of my friends, peers, or just people I know are suffering from pretty serious depression. What they describe as workaholism, despite making tens of millions. Like some of them have made tens of millions in this run, but it means absolutely nothing. And their lives are not where they'd want it to be. Has chasing freedom provided you with contentment or happiness?
Yes. Now, I guess, so the short answer is yes. I'm going to give a longer answer because it could be a very misleading answer as just a yes. And just to kind of validate that set of feelings that they had, or give another example, a thing that I saw in Silicon Valley all the time was I remember having a conversation with a guy who had sold his company to Zynga for like $60 million. But his best friends were like the founders of Twitter and the founders of, you know, Uber. And he was like, I'm not even a part of the club, you know? Like he had done a thing that so many people try to do, so many people wish they could do, but they can't even begin to think about how to do it. And had come out with an 8-figure bank account, you know, and he felt bereft, like he was the loser. And I totally understand like how he was experiencing that set of emotions and validate them. But it was also insane to me. And it's so hard for us to break out of our context and to not compare our lives constantly to those around us. And it's much harder when we actually know people in some ways. And so I guess that the yes that I want to expand on. So I very much like, I guess for me, the freedom is one pursuit, but it's not the only pursuit. The other thing that I would much rather have a seat at the table helping shape the public discourse and the flow of ideas in the world than I would building a company quietly. And this is something I had to learn about myself. It was another reason that I had to leave Silicon Valley, is that like Silicon Valley rewards people who can do the thing that has to be done over and over again, day in, day out, right? And it's kind of the opposite of content in some ways, where you're constantly exploring and changing and making it dynamic. It's like you want to get your widgets to do the thing over and over and over again. And it's a very different skill set, and it's not something that I was particularly good at. In fact, the company that I had last when I was in Silicon Valley was a failure, largely because we were trying to productize what always should have just been a consulting agency. It was a company that helped big brands figure out what they should be doing with new technology, right? Tons of brands were expanding their marketing strategies to include cool new platforms. We tried to LinkedInify it, where you could have these brand managers come on this platform and connect with these cool startups. And no one wanted to do that. What they wanted to do was ask us, well, we're going to just pay you $50,000 on retainer for a year, and you just tell us who to work with. And then you go negotiate the deal and tell us how to run the campaign. It would have been a bonkers successful agency, but that in Silicon Valley is reductively called a lifestyle business. And to be fair, the company had raised venture capital, and that's not going to get a venture capital return. So, anyways, it is a long-winded way of saying that, like, I think part of these answers for anyone is they also have to understand like what is truly motivating for them. And when I stepped back and realized that like I had stopped producing content for like 2 years, like I produced content. I mean, I moved to Silicon Valley to help start this company called change.org. And the way that we built that company now it's the biggest platform for social change on the internet. It has 200 plus employees in 30 countries. It's wildly successful. We started that in like 2007, 2008, 2009. And we knew we wanted to build a social network for social change, didn't know how, like exactly what that was going to look like. It's now very clearly become a petition site. That's its main goal. Back then it was like, okay, it'll be a petition site, it'll be a community hub, it'll be all these different things. But we knew we needed to have users. And so the way that we bootstrapped it was, we were like, let's build a content network, because we can get the first couple million users by having really great content. And so we built a blog network that started with 10 different topic areas. So like climate change, social entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those, within a couple years, or within, I guess, a year, all of those were like ranking 1, 2, or 3 on Google for that topic. If anyone searched social entrepreneurship, it was the blog that I ran. So I helped run the network, and then I ran that blog specifically. So like I spent so much time on content. And then somehow along the way, I just stopped doing content because it wasn't the thing that really mattered for the business. And it took stepping back and being like, wait, but I like doing that. I don't care that that's not the most lucrative thing that you can do. My job probably needs to be to figure out how, if money matters to me, which it does, I'm not like a live off the grid hermit ascetic. And when it comes to freedom, a big part of freedom is money, maybe the biggest part in some ways. But I shifted my mindset to, rather than like, how do I make money in the ways that these other people around me have made money, to, given the thing that I know that I'm good at and that I enjoy and that I just want to do natively, what's the best way to make money around that? And that was a very big shift in thinking about things. Now, coming back to the answer of like chasing freedom, one, I think it's a really good true north. I think it's a really good true north to, if that matters to you. A lot of people, maybe that's not the thing that matters to them. But for me, like, we have a 2-year-old, and I have had to be away on business something like one night, maybe. Like, actually, maybe not. Like, the one night that I wasn't like there at our house was probably like I took my father-in-law to Buenos Aires to learn about Bitcoin and Ethereum and DeFi with a bunch of crypto kids, which is a whole different story. But like, I've been able to be there for her whole life, and like that's amazing to me. That's something that I really prioritize. so I think that like you get the thing that's cool about freedom is that you see little bits of it every day, not having to have an alarm every single morning that you wake up. I mean, I guess I do have an alarm, and she's the 2-year-old, but like every single day that you don't have to wake up at the time that you don't want to is like, that's a little dose of freedom. So it's, as a goal, it's cool because you get these little moments of it day in, day out. Now, that said, I think that the most damaging thing that I've seen, people who are unsuccessful, let me flip the question that you asked earlier about like what's the trait of successful people. I can certainly say that the single biggest trait I've seen in unsuccessful people is entitlement and a desire to blame other people for their misfortune, right? Like it's endemic in unsuccessful people is when they look at things that didn't work out for them, they blame someone else, right? So that failed startup in San Francisco that I mentioned, like if I was sitting here being like, it was these people's fault for not getting it, it was the world's fault for being too early, versus like I can track, like I know exactly why it didn't work. It didn't work because it didn't match the behavior patterns of the demand of the people that we had, and it could have worked in a different way if we did it differently. And when it comes to chasing freedom, like I work, like although I get to spend a bunch more time with her than a lot of people were, and with my family and stuff, and that's really important to me, I'm still working like 80 or 90 hours a week. I mean, I have an entire marketing consulting business on top of producing a podcast 7 days a week, like that's why I said it's table, like hard work is table stakes. You know what I mean? Like everything good and worth doing takes a huge amount of time. Now, I think that I have a different relationship with work now that I'm chasing freedom and things than I might have before. Like when I was at that startup that wasn't the right fit, I was working all the time on bullshit that didn't matter because it was pushing the boulder up the hill, the proverbial boulder up the hill. Like it was never going to get there. And so you can always find more things to do. And so I hope that I've learned better about like not spending time on things that aren't worth doing, but it's not like a pure reduction of time. Like it just takes a ton of time. And I can't imagine it not taking that time. I guess, in the future, I do think that I'd love to be in a position where I can change the ratio of time, where I can take big chunks of time off to reflect and think. Like one thing I don't do as much as I'd like, which is weird because you'd think doing a podcast, you reflect and think all the time. I don't have a lot of time to like reformulate ideas. Like I really want to go read, as weird as it sounds, I want to go read every book and essay and thought about MMT, because I think it's going to be a huge discussion and battle, with Bitcoin kind of representing an opposite perspective. And I'm pretty sure that I know how I feel about these things, but I don't want to, I want to have the chance to actually like engage with it fully, before I just like, not like, in order to be more effective at dismissing it potentially, and that's not something I have time for right now. So I think that like we're all, to some extent, the one thing that rate limits everyone is the time that we have, and figuring out where your priorities lie as it relates to your time now and in the future just feels to me like about as important a thing as anyone can do.
Nathaniel, given how valuable your time is and how your biggest motivator is freedom, I am so happy that you chose to come on the Market Meditations podcast and chat with us for 1 hour, 20 minutes now. Thank you so much for your time. As we draw this podcast to a close, I'd like to ask, is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with? Whether that be a thank you for the podcast, it was hopefully a very good time, or just a platform of yours you'd like to direct them towards?
No, I mean, listen, I really appreciate everyone hanging out. It sounds like this maybe is like a slightly different type of conversation than you normally have. If you were listening and this wasn't your cup of tea, totally cool. But no, I appreciate the chance to just like I said, sit back and be a little bit more philosophical and think through things. I think it's really cool. I do think that the traders that you have who listen to this are likely to be better traders, not for this conversation specifically, but for like being willing to take the time to like actually think about these sort of things. So I think it's really cool that you guys are all here, and I appreciate you being here. If people do want to hang out with my content and hear more from me, the podcast is called The Breakdown. I do it. It's independent. I completely control the content, but it's a distributed in partnership with CoinDesk. So you can find it on CoinDesk. You can also find just my feed directly, just The Breakdown. I'm on Twitter at NLW. I'm basically on every network at NLW. So it's really easy to find me.
Nathaniel, thank you so much. I think most our market meditations readers are already familiar with your platform because we reference you a lot in our newsletter. Thank you so much. Anyone who isn't familiar, make sure you check him out. All the links will be in the description below. And thank you for joining me again for another episode of the Market Meditations podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Market Meditations podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like us to continue bringing you fascinating people from across the world, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you like to listen to these podcasts, and share the episode with a friend. If you have feedback or an idea for a potential guest, reach out to me on Twitter at 𝐉𝐸ℎ𝐴𝐾, and do not forget we write a newsletter covering all important topics in crypto and traditional markets. We send it out 3 times a week. The Market Meditations newsletter. You also get early access to these episodes and you get transcripts and extra notes as well. So make sure to subscribe there as well.